Welcome back to Learning with Merit. Today, let's get started. We've got a CSS zip file here. We're going to go ahead and extract this. So I click right click on that, click extract all. We're going to extract it to the desktop here. I'm going to hit extract. You'll see there it creates my folder, and now I can get rid of this zip file now. And we can look inside this zip file. We'll see we have a CSS folder, and inside of that we have some stuff to get started. In this video, we're going to look at cascading style sheets, the CSS Box Model, the color RGB values. We're going to look at external, internal, and inline CSS. We're going to look at what are selectors, what are classes, what are pseudo-classes, what are IDs, and then rules, declarations, properties, and values in CSS. A lot to cover, but short little pieces each. So what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's a style sheet language that's used for describing the presentation of a document written in HTML or XML. Mostly HTML in this case. It's going to define how elements are displayed on a web page, including things like their layout, the colors, the fonts, and other visual things about them. CSS allows us to separate the structure and the content of a web page from its presentation, and this provides some flexibility and maintainability. So one of the things we can do is we have a .css file. So styles.css is the file that I'm looking at right now, and our files that contain CSS code will end in .css and allow us to do that. Now, this is not the only way that we can put CSS into the file. We can also, if we look here, we can add CSS with an external file here. We can add CSS with some style tags, and we can even add CSS inline. And we're going to look at those now. Let's look at the CSS box model. So this is important for our understanding of how to work with CSS. Without the box model, it's going to be a lot harder to understand what's going on. So here in the green, this is the innermost portion. This is our content. Our content can have a height, it can have a width. The height and the width is going to sit inside of all of the rest of this, so it's important to understand. We're going to have to add all of these other things to it after we do the regular height and width. Around our content, we have something called padding. Padding is going to sit between the border and our content. Then we'll have a border around that. Then we will have a margin around that. The margin is going to be between the border and other elements on the page. Right? So we have content sitting on the inside with a height and width value. Then we have padding around that, the border around that, and then the margin around that. And we also need to remember that we have a top, left, right, and bottom, and all of these values can be changed independently if we need to. Most of the time, we're going to change them all the same, but we might be changing them independently. Let's look at how this might apply to an actual web page. So here I have a simple web page that I've created, and I have some internal CSS that I've added. So what I did is I took all the elements, I removed all the margin and padding from all of those elements. So I wanted to make sure they started at 0 for everything. Then what I did is I took this body selector here and I created a 10-point margin, a 4-point solid green border, and a 10-point padding in there. And then the background color for the entire body is going to be black. Then what I have is I have a single div, so I just went ahead and used the div selector. I created a 4-point solid magenta border and a background color of cyan so that you can see what's going on here. So if we look at this, we actually break this down and we look at the body. We have a margin of 10 points. So around the green here, everything that you see around the green, especially this corner is really good. So around this corner right here is a good place to look. That is going to be the 10 pixel, that's what that is, px for pixel margin. Then the border itself is what we call a 4-point border, and it is green. So there's the border around that body element. And then we have some padding, which you can see is this black on the inside here. This is the padding between the body element and its content, which is actually the div that's sitting in here. Then if we look at the div has no margin because I set everything to have a margin of 0. So you see it sits right up next to the padding from the body. And then what we have is we have a background color of cyan. So because there's also no padding, we just go ahead and see that background color sitting right there. So all this is to do is to illustrate what's going on. So we have margin on the outside of the body here. Then we have the body's border. Then we have the body's padding. Then on the inside we have the border for the content. And then we have the actual content itself inside of the div. So this magenta is from the div, and there's no margin, so it's sitting right up next to the padding. And there is no padding in the div, so this content is sitting right there. Now what if we change some of that? Let's add some margin. I'm going to add a 10-point margin, or a 10 pixel margin I should say, 10 px margin to that div. And let's see how that affects the page. And what you'll see is now I'm adding the margin from my div to the padding from the body, right? So I have basically 20 pixels in between all of that. Now if I want to add some padding for the content inside my div, I could do padding, and let's add 10 px for that. Let's see how that changes this content right in here. If I do that, you see how I got more space around this content now? So now what we have is we have padding around the body, then the border for the body, then we have, we have the margin for the body, then we have the border, then we have padding for the body, then we have the margin for the div, which is all this black space right here is the padding for the body and the margin for the div combined. Then we have the border for the div, then we have the padding for the div, which is kind of hard to see around the content, but it's easy to see when it changes. And so we now have the content sitting right in there. All right, so the box model can be kind of confusing, but as you begin to work with it, it will make more sense. Let's see what happens if I add some more things in there. So real quickly, I went ahead and added 2 more divs there, and you can see that we have padding around those divs. So if we look between the different divs, you'll see that this is smaller than the outside here, and that's because in between the 2 divs, we're not really dealing with the padding from the body, right? And so now we have just the margin that's sitting in here between these divs, and then of course we have the padding. But maybe I want to change this. Maybe I want to make these as columns. Let's see what that might be. So I changed my CSS styles here. I added 2 things to the body. I turned the display to flex, and then I did justify content center. And so what now occurs is all of my divs are now in a row like this. All right, so I changed. So normally they are stacked on top of each other, but in this case I changed them to a row. But you'll still see we have our margin, we have our border, we have our padding, and then we have the content in the middle. Let's talk about RGB values. So when we deal with RGB values and we are working with colors in coding of any type, we are going to deal with both decimal RGB values and hexadecimal RGB values. And it really doesn't matter which one you pick. Most programs these days will accept both, either, or whichever. Right? They all pretty much work. And I've got some examples for you here. These, of course, are not exhaustive examples, but plenty enough examples that you can get the idea. So when we look at RGB values, we're going to have 3 values, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. If we combine all 3 of those values at their most powerful, so 255, 255, and 255, or FF, FF, and FF, we get white. If we remove them entirely, we get black. And this is how the colors are going to work. And then we have everything in between. Decimals, again, each value is going to be 1 byte, so that's 8 bits. The largest value that we can get is 256, so 0 through 255 is 256 values in decimal. And what we can see here is we combine those in different proportions and we get different colors. So R is going to be red, G is going to be green, B is going to be blue. So if I do 25500, I get red. If I do 02550, I get green. If I do 25500, I should get, or I'm saying 00255, I should get blue. And then of course we've got some other colors in there too. Hexadecimal is going to be from 00 to FF. Again, this is going to be 1 byte, and 1 hexadecimal byte can go from 0 to also 255, but in this case it's using hexadecimal notation, which is FF. So all zeros is black, all F's is white. If we do FF00, 0000, we get red. If we do 0000FF, we get blue, and 0FF00 is green. Of course, you can see that in the table there. So this is how we use these different colors, and in most programs there is a color picker, and if there's not, you can look one up online very easily and will help you pick an exact color using these values. So there are 3 ways that we can add CSS to an HTML file, and some of them may already be familiar to you and some of them may not. But the 3 ways are we can add external CSS through a separate file. In this case, we're going to use styles.css, but you can name it something else. It just needs to end in .css, and we're going to link that to our HTML document. We could also use internal CSS by using a special tag called the style tag, and this is going to embed the CSS into the HTML document. This is fairly easy if you want to combine the HTML file and the CSS together. And then we also have inline CSS where we can add it directly to an individual element of the page. So if we look at some of these examples, here is the tag we would use to link some CSS. So let's show you how to add some external CSS. So we are going to use the link tag, and this is used to define a link between the current document and some external resource. In this particular case, we're going to link it to a style sheet. Then we use the rel attribute, which is for relationship, and this attribute is going to define what's the relationship between the current document and the linked resource. In this case, it's a style sheet type. Then we're going to use type, and this specifies the type of the linked resource. In this case, we're looking at it's a cascading style sheet file, or CSS. So text/CSS is what we're going to use as the value for that. Then we're going to use the href, or hypertext reference attribute, and we need to tell it where, we need to point it towards where is the actual file or the location, the uniform resource locator, or the location in this case of the file in our folder, and we're going to say styles.css because it's already in the same folder as what we're looking for here. So that's how we add some external CSS to our file. Maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe we want to write the CSS right here inside the HTML file. We can use these 2 style tags right here. So we have open style and a close style tag, and then you'll notice that my comments here are a little bit different. So here I use the angle brackets with an exclamation point and 2 dashes, but here I'm using / and a star. So this is an inline CSS comment, and this is a multi-line CSS comment, and you see they use the same method of making a comment. But one of the things that this shows us is if I was to copy this comment right here and I was to stick it inside this style tag, you see that some weird stuff happens. It's not making a comment like it did on the other line. That's because everything inside those style tags is CSS code. So in order to make comments in CSS, I have to use a different method of making a comment. And we'll look at how to use that style tag as well. So remember, in between the style tags, you're writing CSS, not HTML. Then we can look at inline CSS. You've probably seen this before, but if not, it's okay. What we've got here is we've got a h1 tag, and then we have the style attribute. The style attribute is how we provide CSS inside of our HTML. So remember, the style attribute is still HTML. What is the actual CSS is what we've put here in the text. Now, one of the things we need to get in a habit of is making sure that there's a semicolon right there, because if you add multiple property value pieces here, or declarations, then we are going to need that semicolon to separate them. So remember, we got 3 ways we can add this. We've got external CSS, which we use a link tag for. We've got internal CSS, which we use the style tags for, and we have inline CSS, which we add directly to the element that we are looking at. Let's take a look at a selector here. So a selector is a pattern used to select and style an HTML element. So these selectors can target elements, classes, IDs, attributes, or any combination of these. So that's why we're starting with selectors here. Let's scroll down. Here is a lot of notes, but if we finally get to the CSS, here's what we have. We have lots of stuff. Maybe a little confusing to you, but what we can do is we can point out the selectors. This right here is a selector. This little star or wild card is used to represent all elements of the page. So that selects everything, all elements on the entire page. Then we have the body selector here. This selects the body element. H1 is going to select the heading 1 element, all of them. P is going to select all of the paragraph elements. A is going to select all of the anchor elements. But then we have something a little special here. I have A with a colon and hover, and you'll see that the thing changes. This is a little bit different selector. We'll talk about that in just a second, but it's still a selector. This one, also a little bit of a different type of selector. We'll talk about that one as well. And once again, yet another different type of selector. Now these select different things. You'll notice these aren't selecting element names this time. They're selecting something else. And then of course we have this one down here. Again, a different type of selector, but still a selector whenever we look at it. So these are the different ways that we attach the CSS to particular elements or pieces of the page. Let's take a look at a CSS class now. So a class is a way to apply styles to multiple elements, and we define this with a period in CSS, and we use this in order to group certain things, right? We want to say a certain class. And what this does is it allows us to group different elements together to give them the same type of styling. So we're going to scroll all the way down here and find a selector that's a class. So here we have a selector that's a class. The way that we know it's a class is because it uses this dot syntax right here. So this says dot, and then the class itself is going to be called highlight, right? Now what this does is that everything with the class highlight will be given this CSS. So here I am in my HTML, and I can see I use the class attribute to indicate a class, right? And I'm going to use this class highlight. And so everything in my body for this particular case is going to get the highlight CSS that we see right here. But maybe I want to do that for multiple divs, for example. I'll add some divs here. So I added some divs here, and you can see that every other one I gave the class highlight, right? So instead of selecting all divs and making every single div the same way, I can make certain divs part of a class, and in this case the class highlight, and it's going to highlight it yellow. So I put several headings, and each heading says am I highlighted, and if we look at our page here, you'll see that this one is highlighted, this one is highlighted, and this one is highlighted, but the other ones are not highlighted in between. And so what this shows us is that by using this class, I can say these certain ones receive this CSS right here and others do not. Classes. Let's talk about pseudo-classes now. So a pseudo-class, this is a keyword added to a selector to style a specific state or condition of an element. This is what makes some of this stuff really cool. So let's look at pseudo-classes down here. I'll scroll down and I look at my CSS rules that I have for this page, and I come down here and I find this one right here. This is my CSS rule we want to look at. The pseudo-class is hover, and we'll see that it's a different color. It uses a colon and hover, and this is for when my mouse hovers over the anchor tag that we have, or the anchor element. And what it's going to do is it's going to change the background color to black color and the border. And the cool thing about this is normally we have this color, right? We have just a normal blue looking color for our anchor tag, and there's no text decoration. But when I hover over, it's going to change. And this is how I can make like the illusion of a button, right? It's not really a button. It just changes some stuff, but it feels like a button to us. So here in my HTML, we will see that I have a single div inside of the body element. And inside of the div element, I have the anchor element for my tag here. So I'm going to look at it, and I have no hypertext reference. There's nothing in there. I just want to show you what happens, and we call this hover over me. So if I pull this up and I reload, you'll see that all we have right there is just something that says hover over me. But when I hover over it, look at that. Look, it changes its background to black, it changes the text color to white, and the border now suddenly becomes this green thing. So it kind of looks like a button, right? And if I click on it, all it does is really reload the page. But I can just sort of, look at that. Isn't that really cool? And all it does, it's literally just changing the colors and some things as your mouse hovers over it. And so it gives you this illusion of there's like a button there to work with. So there are some more that you can look at, of course, but this is a classic example of a pseudo class that allows us to change a property whenever something specific happens to an element, like hovering over it. Pseudo classes. Next, let's look at IDs. So IDs are similar to a class, but should be unique on a page. So what this means is if I want to change one specific thing, that's what I use an ID for, right? I use a class if I want to change a group of things. I use a pseudo class if I want to, change a condition or something like that, like when I hover over something. But I use an ID when I want to select one specific thing on the page and say this thing is going to look this way, right? And it's only that thing, so it's some special thing. We're going to use ID for that. So if we come down here and we look at our CSS rules that I have created, I actually scroll down and we'll keep going, and we finally get to this little hashtag symbol. The hashtag symbol indicates a ID when we use our selector. So here's our selector. We're using the hashtag symbol with the selector, and our ID is going to be called special section. And I've defined my CSS rules with my properties and values for this. And if I come over here and look at the index.html, I've created 4 divs here, and each of them say hello world, but I've given an ID to this first one. So ID is our attribute, and we are giving it the ID special section, and it's going to have all of those CSS properties that we just provided right here. So if we actually look at this, what we'll see is each of them, whoops, it should be open, but we will open it again. I'm going to copy the path here. There it is. Copy the path, open. We are going to paste that, and we are going to hit enter. And we will see that with our 4 divs, each of them says hello world, hello world, hello world, hello world, right? But this top one is the only one that has that special set of rules. And of course, I did this freakishly on purpose, right? The whole cyan and magenta thing is a little weird, but it makes it very clear that this is different than the rest of these that we are working with. And so whenever I use IDs, that's so I can select a specific thing on the page and say this thing is going to look this way, and that is IDs in CSS. Next, we're going to look at rules, declarations, properties, and values. So let's look at a rule. So a rule consists of one or more declarations, and it's associated with a selector, and it defines how the selected elements should be styled. We need to know what a declaration is. This is a combination of a CSS property and its corresponding value. Declarations are enclosed with curly braces. We're going to see that. And then an example is the property colon, the value, and then a semicolon. We'll look at an example here in just a second. So we need to know what properties and values are. A property is an attribute of an element that you want to style. So this could be color, font size, margin, background color. There's a whole bunch of them. Impossible to go over in one video, but there are plenty of references that we can look at. And then we have value here. Value is the value that we give to the property. So a specific setting assigned to a property, like for example, a color could be hashtag 333 of the color property. So let's actually go and look at this. Here's a general outline of what it looks like. So we have a rule. The entire rule consists of all of this stuff right here. So we have a selector. Then we have inside of that our declaration block. Each one of these is an individual declaration. The declarations will have a property. You'll see a colon, you'll have a value, and a semicolon. So let's look at these. So this first one right here, this is our CSS rule. Our selector is the wildcard operator. That's to indicate literally all elements. So that's our selector. Our declaration block is this sitting right in here. We have the 3 properties. We have margin, we have padding, and we have box sizing. Those are our properties. And then 0, 0, and border box are going to be the values for that. We can look at another one. Body is our selector. We have the font family, line height, background color, and color. Those are our properties. And then our values sit on the other side of the colon. And then we have a semicolon between each of these. Of course, we've got a lot of stuff that wants to pop up. But this whole thing right here is a CSS rule. And the extra stuff that you see around it are comments. Here's our H1 CSS rule. H1 is our selector, color is our property, and this hex value for a color right here is our value. So hopefully that makes sense. Each of these, as you see, that's another rule, that's another rule, This is still another rule, even though our selector includes a pseudo class. This is another rule, even though our selector is a class. So it doesn't matter what the selector is, this is going to be a rule, and you'll see that the declaration block is always inside of those semicolons. And then this one down here is advanced stuff that we will talk about in the future. So what we always have is we have a selector, we have curly braces. Inside the curly braces, we have a declaration block, which consists of our properties and values and individual declarations. So this is an individual declaration. Here's the property, which is background color. Here is the value, which is cyan. We're going to separate the property and value with a colon, and we're going to separate declarations with a semicolon. Then we have border as another property. Here is the value for that. And we have padding as another property and the value for that. So hopefully that should make good sense. This is our entire rule, and that is going to be rules, declarations, properties, and values in CSS. Pretty simple stuff.